Hey guys, so I'm going to be reading to you from I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I tried to find an audiobook of this online, but the only one I found, I was not a big fan of the voice. And I don't know that mine's any better, but it isn't as like high pitched and yeah, so I think that you guys might prefer possibly me reading it to you. So in the classroom, you guys will find a post that has both the reading schedule and it has the um, link to the PDF that I am reading this off of. One of the reasons why we're doing this book is because I do actually have access to it for um, an online book. So yeah, we had to make do. So for this first time around, we're going to be reading chapters 1 through 3. So I'm going to get that started. Before the book starts, there is this little kind of prologue. It starts on page 4 of the PDF. You'll start to notice that the PDF is kind of like a two pages on each page. So probably going forward, I'm going to be reading this to you probably every time. So bear with me. Hopefully it's not too painful. So, what you looking at me for? I didn't come to stay. I hadn't so much forgot as I couldn't bring myself to remember. Other things were more important. What you looking at me for? I didn't come to stay. Whether I could remember the rest of the poem or not was immaterial. The truth of the statement was like a wadded up handkerchief sopping wet in my fists, and the sooner they accepted it, the quicker I could let my hands open and the air would cool my palms. What are you looking at me for? The children's section of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church was wiggling and giggling over my well-known forgetfulness. The dress I wore was lavender taffeta, and each time I breathed, it rustled, and now that I was sucking in air to breathe out shame, it sounded like crepe paper on the back of hearses. As I'd watched Mama put ruffles on the hem and cute little tucks around the waist, I knew that once I put it on, I'd look like a movie star. It was silk, and that made up for the awful color. I was going to look like one of the sweet little white girls who were everybody's dream of what was right with the world. Hanging softly over the black singer's sewing machine, it looked like magic. And when people saw me wearing it, they were going to run up to me and say, Marguerite. Sometimes it was, Dear Marguerite, forgive us, please. We didn't know who you were. And I would answer generously, No, you couldn't have known. Of course I forgive you. Just thinking about it made me go around with angel's dust sprinkled over my face for days. But Easter's early morning sun had shown the dress to be plain, ugly cut down from a white woman's once was purple throwaway. It was old lady long, too, but it didn't hide my skinny legs, which had been greased with Blue Seal Vaseline and powdered with the Arkansas red clay. The age-faded color made my skin look dirty like mud, and everyone in church was looking at my skinny legs. Wouldn't they be surprised when one day I woke out of my black, ugly dream and my real hair, which was long and blonde, would take the place of the kinky mass that Mama wouldn't let me straighten? My light blue eyes were going to hypnotize them after all the things they said about my daddy must have been a Chinaman. I thought they meant made out of china like a cup, because my eyes were so small and squinty. Then they would understand why I had never picked up a southern accent or spoke the common slang, and why I had to be forced to eat pigs' tails and snouts. Because I was really white, and because a cruel fairy stepmother who was understandably jealous of my beauty had turned me into a too big Negro girl with nappy black hair, broad feet, and a space between her teeth that would hold a number 2 pencil. What you lookin'? The minister's wife leaned towards me, her long yellow face full of sorry. She whispered, I just come to tell you it's Easter Day. I repeated, jamming the words together. I just come to tell you it's Easter Day, as low as possible. The giggles hung in the air like melting clouds that were waiting to rain on me. I held up 2 fingers close to my chest, which meant that I had to go to the toilet, and tiptoed toward the rear of the church. Dimly, somewhere over my head, I heard a lady singing, Lord bless the child and praise God. My head was up and my eyes were open, but I didn't see anything. Halfway down the aisle, the church exploded with, Were you there when they crucified my Lord? And I tripped over a foot stuck out from the children's pew. I stumbled and started to say something, or maybe to scream, but a green persimmon, or it could have been a lemon, caught me between the legs and squeezed. I tasted the sour on my tongue, and I felt it in the back of my mouth. Then, before I reached the door, the sting was burning down my legs and into my Sunday socks. I tried to hold, to squeeze it back, to keep it from speeding, but when I reached the church porch, I knew I'd have to let it go, or I would probably run right back up to my head, and that my poor head would burst like a dropped watermelon, and all the brains and spit and tongue and eyes would roll all over the place. So I ran down into the yard and let it go. I ran, peeing and crying, not toward the toilet out back, but to our house. Get a whipping for it, to be sure, and the nasty children would have something new to tease me about. I laughed anyway, partially for the sweet release. Still, the greater joy came not only from being liberated from the silly church, but from the knowledge that I wouldn't die from a busted head. If growing up is painful for the Southern black girl, being aware of her displacement is the rust on the razor that threatens the throat. It's an unnecessary insult. Okay, chapter 1. When I was 3 and Bailey 4, we had arrived in the musty little town wearing tags on our wrists which instructed, to whom it may concern, that we were Marguerite and Bailey Johnson Jr. from Long Beach, California, en route to Stamps, Arkansas, care of Mrs. Annie Henderson. Our parents had decided to put an end to their calamitous marriage, and father shipped us home to his mother. A porter had been charged with our welfare. He got off the train the next day in Arizona, and our tickets were pinned to my brother's inside coat pocket. I don't remember much of the trip, but after we reached the segregated southern part of the journey, things must have looked up. Negro passengers who always traveled with loaded lunch boxes felt sorry for the poor little motherless darlings and plied us with cold fried chicken and potato salad. Years later, I discovered that the United States had been crossed thousands of times by frightened black children traveling alone to their newly affluent parents in northern cities, or back to grandmothers in southern towns when the urban North had renegated on its economic promises. The town reacted to us as its inhabitants had reacted to all things new before our coming. It regarded us a while without curiosity but with caution, and after we were seen to be harmless and children, it closed in around us as a real mother embraces a stranger's child, warmly but not too familiarly. We lived with our grandmother and uncle in the rear of the store. It was always spoken of with a capital S, which she had owned some 25 years. Earlier in the century, Mama, we soon stopped calling her grandmother, sold lunches to the sawmen in the lumber yard, East Stamps, and the seamen at the cotton gin, West Stamps. Her crisp meat pies and cool lemonade, when joined to her miraculous ability to be in two places at the same time, assured her business success. From being a mobile lunch counter, she set up a stand between the 2 points of fiscal interest and supplied the workers' needs for a few years. Then she had the store built in the heart of the Negro area. Over the years, it became the lay center of activities in town. On Saturdays, barbers sat their customers in the shade on the porch of the store, and troubadours, in their ceaseless crawlings to the south, leaned across its benches, sang their sad songs of the brazos while they played juice harps and cigar box guitars. The formal name of the store was the I have no idea. W.M. Johnson General Merchandise Store. Customers could find food staples, a good variety of colored thread, mesh for hogs, corn for chickens, coal oil for lamps, light bulbs for the wealthy, shoestrings, hair dressings, balloons, and flower seeds. Anything not visible had only to be ordered. Until we became familiar enough to belong to the store and it to us, we were locked up in a fun house of things where the attendant had gone home for life. Each year I watched the field across from the store turn caterpillar green, then gradually frosty white. I knew exactly how long it would be before the big wagons would pull into the front yard and load in on the cotton pickers at daybreak to carry them to the remains of slavery's plantations. During the picking season, my grandmother would get out of bed at 4 o'clock. She never used an alarm clock, and creak down to her knees and chant in a sleep-filled voice, "Our Father, thank you for letting me see this new day. Thank you that you didn't allow the bed I lay on last night to be my cooling board, nor my blanket my winding sheet. Guide my feet this day along the straight and narrow, and help me to put a bridle on my tongue. Bless this house and everybody in it. Thank you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen." Before she had quite arisen, she called our names and issued orders, and pushed her large feet into homemade slippers and across the bare lye-washed wooden floors to light the coal oil lamp. The lamplight in the store gave a soft make-believe feeling to our world which made me want to whisper and walk about on tiptoe. The odors of onions and oranges and kerosene had been mixed all night and wouldn't be disturbed until the wooded slat was removed from the door and the early morning air forced its way in with the bodies of the people who had walked miles to reach the pickup place. Sister, I'll have 2 cans of sardines. I'm going to work so fast today, I'm going to make you look like you standing still. Let me have a hunk of cheese and some sody crackers. Just give me a couple of them fat peanut patties. That'll be from a picker who was taking his lunch. The greasy brown paper sack was stuck behind the bib of his overalls. He'd used the candy as a snack before the noon sun called the workers to rest. In these tender mornings, the store was full of laughing, joking, boasting, and bragging. One man was going to pick 200 pounds of cotton and another 300. Even the children were promising to bring home 4 bits and 6 bits. The champion picker of the day before was the hero of the dawn. If he prophesied that the cotton in today's field was going to be sparse and stick to the boils like glue, or bowls like glue, every listener would grunt a hearty agreement. The sound of the empty cotton sacks dragging over the floor and the murmurs of waking people were sliced by the cash register as we rang up the 5-cent sales. If the morning sounds and smells were touched with the supernatural, the late afternoon had all the features of the normal Arkansas life. In the dying sunlight, the people dragged rather than their empty cotton sacks. Brought back to the store, the pickers would step out of the backs of trucks and fold down, dirt disappointed, to the ground. No matter how much they had picked, it wasn't enough. Their wages wouldn't even get them out of debt to my grandmother, not to mention the staggering bill that was weighted on them at the White Commissionary downtown. The sounds of the new morning had been replaced with grumbles about cheating houses, weighted scales, snakes, skimpy cotton, and dusty rows. In later years, I was to confront the stereotyped picture of gay song-singing cotton pickers with such inordinate rage that I was told even by fellow blacks my paranoia was embarrassing. But I had seen the fingers cut by the mean little cotton bolls, and I had witnessed the backs and shoulders and arms and legs resisting any further demands. Some of the workers would leave their sacks at the store to be picked up the following morning, but a few had to take them home for repairs. I winced to picture them sewing the coarse material under a coal oil lamp with fingers stiffening from the day's work. In too few hours, they would have to walk back to Sister Henderson's store, get victuals and load again onto the trucks. Then they would face another day of trying to earn enough for the whole year with the heavy knowledge that they were going to end the season as they started it. Without the money or credit necessary to sustain a family for 3 months, in cotton-picking time, the late afternoons revealed the harshness of black Southern life, which in the early morning had been softened by nature's blessing of grogginess, forgetfulness, and the soft lamplight. Chapter 2. When Bailey was 6 and I a year younger, we used to rattle off the times tables with a speed I was later to see Chinese children in San Francisco employ on their abscesses. Our summer gray, pot-bellied stove bloomed rosy red during winter and became a severe disciplinarian threat if we were so foolish as to indulge in making mistakes. Uncle Willie used to sit like a giant black Z. He had been crippled as a child, and hear us testify to the Lafayette County Training School's abilities. His face pulled down on the left side, as if a pulley had been attached to his lower teeth, and his left hand was only a mite bigger than Bailey's. But on the second mistake, or on the third hesitation, his big, overgrown right hand would catch one of us behind the collar, and in the same moment would thrust the culprit toward the dull red heater, which throbbed like a devil's toothache. We were never burned, although once I might have been when I was so terrified I tried to jump onto the stove to remove the possibility of its remaining a threat. Like most children, I thought if I could face the worst danger voluntarily and triumph, I would forever hold power over it. But in my case of sacrificial effort, I was thwarted. Uncle Willie held tight to my dress, and I only got close enough to smell the clean, dry scent of hot iron. We learned the times tables without understanding their grand principles simply because we had the capacity and no alternative. The tragedy of lameness seems so unfair to children that they are embarrassed in its presence, and they most recently, of nature's mold, sense that they have only narrowly missed being another of her jokes. In relief at the narrow escape, they vent their emotions in impatience and criticism of the unlucky cripple. Mama related times without end and without any show of emotion how Uncle Willie had been dropped when he was 3 years old by a woman who was minding him. She seemed to hold no rancor against the babysitter, nor for her just God who allowed the accident. She felt it necessary to explain over and over again to those who knew the story by heart that he wasn't born that way. In our society, where two-legged, two-armed, strong black men were able at best to eke out only the necessities of life, Uncle Willie, with his starched shirts, shined shoes, and shelves full of food, was the whipping boy and butt of jokes of the underemployed and underpaid. Fate not only disabled him, but laid a double-tiered barrier in his path. He was also proud and sensitive. Therefore, he couldn't pretend that he wasn't crippled, nor could he deceive himself that people were not repelled by his defect. Only once in all of the years of trying not to watch him, I saw him pretend to himself and others that he wasn't lame. Coming home from school one day, I saw a dark car in our front yard. I rushed in to find a strange man and woman. Uncle Willie said later they were school teachers from Little Rock, drinking Dr. Pepper in the cool of the store. I sensed a wrongness around me, like an alarm clock that had gone off without being set. I knew it couldn't be the strangers. Not frequently, but often enough, travelers pulled off the main road to buy tobacco or soft drinks in the only Negro store in Stamps. When I looked at Uncle Willie, I knew that what was pulling my mind's coattails. He was standing erect behind the counter, not leaning forward or resting on the small shelf that had been built for him. Erect. His eyes seemed to hold me with a mixture of threats and appeal. I dutifully greeted the strangers and roamed my eyes around for his walking stick. It was nowhere to be seen. He said, my niece, she's just come from school. Then to the couple, you know how children are these days. They play all day at school and can't wait to get home and play some more. The people smiled very friendly. He added, go out and play, sister. The lady laughed in a soft Arkansas voice and said, well, you know, Mr. Johnson, they say you're only a child once. Have you children of your own? Uncle Willie looked at me with an impatience I hadn't seen in his face, even when he took 30 minutes to loop the laces over his high-top shoes. I thought I told you to go. Go outside and play. Before I left, I saw him lean back on the shelves of Garrett Snuff, Prince Albert, and spark-plug chewing tobacco. No, ma'am. No children and no wife. He tried to laugh. I have an old mother and my brother's 2 children to look after. I didn't mind his using us to make himself look good. In fact, I would have pretended to be his daughter if he wanted me to. Not only did I not feel any loyalty to my own father, I figured that if I had been Uncle Willie's child, I would have received much better treatment. The couple left after a few minutes, and from the back of the house I watched the red cars scare chickens, raise dust, and disappear towards Magnolia. Uncle Willie was making his way down the long-shadowed aisle between the shelves and the counter, hand over hand, like a man climbing out of a dream. I stayed quiet and watched him lurch from one side, bumping the other until he reached the coal oil tank. He put his hand behind that dark recess and took his cane in the strong fist and shifted his weight on the wooden support. He thought he had pulled it off. I'll never know why it was important to him that the couple, he said later that he'd never seen them before, would take a picture of a whole Mr. Johnson back to Little Rock. He must have tired of being crippled, as prisoners tire of penitentiary bars and the guilty tire of blame. The high-top shoes and the cane, his uncontrollable muscles and thick tongue, and the looks he suffered of either contempt or pity had simply worn him out, and for one afternoon, one part of an afternoon, he wanted no part of them. I understood and felt closer to him at that moment than ever before or since. During these years in Stamps, I met and fell in love with William Shakespeare. He was my first white love. Although I enjoyed and respected Kipling, Poe, Butler, Thackeray, and Henley, I saved my young and loyal passion for Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, and W.E.B. Du Bois' Litany at Atlanta. But it was Shakespeare who said, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. It was a state with which I felt myself most familiar. I pacified myself about his whiteness by saying that after all, he had been dead so long it couldn't matter to anyone anymore. Bailey and I decided to memorize a scene from The Merchant of Venice, but we realized that Mama would question us about the author and that we'd have to tell her that Shakespeare was white and it wouldn't matter to her whether he was dead or not. So we chose The Creation by James Weldon Johnson instead. Chapter 3. Weighing the half-pounds of flour, excluding the scoop and depositing them dust-free into the thin paper sacks, held a simple kind of adventure for me. I developed an eye for measuring how full a silver-looking ladle of flour, mash, meal, sugar, or corn had to be to push the scale indicator over to 8 ounces or 1 pound. When I was absolutely accurate, our appreciative customers used to admire. Sister Henderson's sure got some smart grandchildrens. If I was off in the store's favor, the eagle-eyed woman would say, "Put some more in that sack, child. Don't you try to make your profit off of me." Then I would quietly but persistently punish myself. For every bad judgment, the fine was no silver-wrapped kisses, the sweet chocolate drops that I loved more than anything in the world except Bailey, and maybe canned pineapples. My obsession with pineapples nearly drove me mad. I dreamt of the days when I would be grown and able to buy a whole carton for myself alone. Although the syrupy golden rings sat in their exotic cans on our shelves year-round, we only tasted them during Christmas. Mama used to make the juice to make almost black fruit cakes. Then she lined heavy soot-encrusted iron skillets with the pineapple rings for rich upside-down cakes. Bailey and I received one slice each, and I carried mine around for hours, shredding off the fruit until nothing was left except the perfume on my fingers. I'd like to think that my desire for pineapples was so sacred that I wouldn't allow myself to steal a can, which was possible, and eat it alone out in the garden, but I'm certain that I must have weighed the possibility of the scent exposing me and didn't have the nerve to attempt it. Until I was 13 and left Arkansas for good, the store was my favorite place to be. Alone and empty in the mornings, it looked like an unopened present from a stranger. Opening the front doors was pulling the ribbon of the unexpected gift. The light would come in softly. We faced north, easing itself over the shelves of mackerel, salmon, tobacco, thread. It fell flat on the big vat of lard, and by noontime during the summer, the grease had softened to a thick soup. Whenever I walked into the store in the afternoon, I sensed that it was tired. I alone could hear the slow pulse of its job half done. But just before bedtime, after numerous people had walked in and out, had argued over their bills or joked about their neighbors or just dropped in to give Sister Henderson a "hey y'all," the promise of magic mornings returned to the store and spread itself over the family in washed life waves. Mama opened boxes of crispy crackers, and we sat around the meat block at the rear of the store. I sliced onions, and Bailey opened 2 or even 3 cans of sardines and allowed their juice of oil and fishing boats to ooze down and around the sides. That was supper. In the evening, when we were alone like that, Uncle Willie didn't stutter or shake or give any indication that he had an affliction. It seemed that the peace of a day's ending was an assurance that the covenant God made with children, Negroes, and the crippled was still in effect. Throwing scoops of corn to the chickens and mixing sour dry mash with leftover food and oily dishwater for the hogs were among our evening chores. Bailey and I sloshed down twilight trails to the pig pens. Standing in the first fence rungs, we poured down the unappealing concoctions to our grateful hogs. They mashed their tender pink snouts down into the slop and rooted and grunted their satisfaction. We always grunted a reply, only half in jest. We were also grateful that we had concluded the dirtiest of chores and had only gotten the evil-smelling swill on our shoes, stockings, feet, and hands. Late one day, as we were attending to the pigs, I heard a horse in the front yard. It really should have been called the driveway, except that there was nothing to drive into it, and ran to find out who had come riding up on a Thursday evening, when even Mr. Stewart, the quiet, bitter man who owned a riding horse, would be resting by his warm fire until the morning called him out to turn over his field. The used-to-be sheriff sat rakishly astraddle his horse. His nonchalance was meant to convey his authority and power over even dumb animals. How much more capable he would be with Negroes, it went without saying. His twang jogged in the brittle air. From the side of the store, Bailey and I heard him say to Mama, "Annie, tell Willie he better lay low tonight. A crazy nigger messed with a white lady today. Some of the boys will be coming over here later." Even after the slow drag of years, I remember the sense of fear which filled my mouth with hot, dry air and made my body light. The boys? Those cement faces and eyes of hate that burned the clothes off you if they happened to see you lounging in the main street downtown on Saturday. Boys? It seemed to me that youth had never happened to them. Boys? No, rather men who were covered with graves, dust, and age without beauty or learning, the ugliness and rottenness of old abominations. If on Judgment Day I were summoned by St. Peter to give testimony to the used-to-be sheriff's act of kindness, I would be unable to say anything in his behalf. His confidence that my uncle and every other black man who heard of the Klan's coming ride would scurry under their houses to hide in chicken droppings was too humiliating to hear. Without waiting for Mama's thanks, he rode out of the yard, sure that things were as they should be, and that he was a gentle squire, saving the deserving serfs from the law of the land which he condoned. Immediately, while his horse's hoofs were still loudly thudding the ground, Mamma blew out the coal oil lamps. She had a quiet, hard talk with Uncle Willie and called Bailey and me into the store. We were told to take the potatoes and onions out of their bins and knock out the dividing walls that kept them apart. Then, with a tedious and fearful slowness, Uncle Willie gave me his rubber-tipped cane and bent down to get into the now enlarged empty bin. It took forever before he lay down flat, and then we covered him with potatoes and onions, layer upon layer, like a casserole. Grandmother knelt praying in the darkened store. It was fortunate that the boys didn't ride into our yard that evening and insist that Mama open the store. They would have surely found Uncle Willie and just as surely lynched him. He moaned the whole night through as if he had, in fact, been guilty of some heinous crime. The heavy sounds pushed their way up out of the blanket of vegetables, and I pictured his mouth pulling down on the right side and his saliva flowing into the eyes of new potatoes and waiting there like dewdrops for the warmth of morning.